Pam Bondi arrived at 9:26 a.m. with 4 attorneys and 2 aides, carrying the confidence of someone who had already navigated confirmation hearings and months of oversight. For the first hour, everything followed a predictable pattern. The questions were measured, controlled, and safely answered within the boundaries of legal language. Nothing unusual, nothing disruptive. By the 90-minute mark, most of the press had already left, filing their reports based on what they assumed the hearing was about. But what mattered had not happened yet. At 1 hour and 49 minutes, Gregory Meeks quietly reached for a folder. No announcement, no shift in tone, just a deliberate movement. What he placed on the table was not just a document, but the beginning of a sequence. The first page was a transaction record, date, routing number, and an authorization signature. On its own, it was unremarkable. But context transformed it. The date fell just 11 days after a key reclassification order, the routing number traced to a recently created account, and the signature did not match a standard DOJ authorization pattern. Instead of asking a question immediately, Meeks placed additional documents on the table, aligning them carefully. This was not random, it was structure. Each document added a layer, forming a visible pattern rather than isolated facts. Only then did he ask a simple question: who authorized that transfer? The question was narrow, direct, and tied to evidence already in view. Bondi responded cautiously, asking for time to review the documents. On the surface, it sounded reasonable, but it avoided the timeline that had just been established. Meeks did not challenge her directly. Instead, he introduced a privilege log, 31 pages produced under a FOIA request months earlier. FOIA is not optional, it is a legal obligation. Yet within that log, multiple entries were marked under executive privilege, despite prior public statements claiming no such protections existed in the related files. 2 official records now sat side by side, both authenticated, both on the record, and both unable to be true at the same time. The room shifted without a word being spoken. Even the remaining reporters stopped writing, because the contradiction no longer required explanation, it was visible. Bondi's physical reactions were subtle but telling, small gestures of control under pressure. When reminded she was under oath, the dynamic changed further. This was no longer a political exchange. It had entered a legal framework where statements are measured against evidence. Then came the next layer. An FBI FD 302 report documenting a prior interview with a DOJ official. Inside it were references to undisclosed communications occurring in the same narrow timeframe as the transaction. When placed alongside the earlier documents, a pattern emerged, multiple independent sources pointing to the same sequence of events. Bondi again requested time, but this time Meeks responded with another document, a receipt confirming her office had already received and reviewed the FD 302 weeks earlier. At that point, the issue was no longer memory. It was record. 4 authenticated documents now sat aligned, each reinforcing the other. What had been built was not a single contradiction, but a chain, a transaction tied to a date, a privilege log contradicting a public statement, an FBI report establishing undisclosed contact, and confirmation that the information had already been reviewed. Individually, each piece could be explained. Together, they formed a structure that could not easily be dismissed. This is where the hearing shifted into something else entirely. It was no longer about questions, it was about sequence. And once a sequence is established, it does not bend to hesitation or careful wording. It either holds or it exposes. By slowing the pace, allowing each document to settle, Meeks ensured that the room understood what was unfolding. Then, as the final step in that structure, he reached back into the folder for a 5th document. One that had been there from the beginning, waiting for the exact moment when everything else was already in place. In a structure like this, timing is not about urgency, it is about inevitability. Meeks removed the final document without announcing it and placed it face down on the table, then paused for 4 seconds. In an ordinary conversation, that pause would mean nothing, but in a hearing under oath, with cameras fixed and attorneys watching every movement, it created pressure. When he finally turned it over, it appeared to be a standard Department of Justice authorization memo. Plain, unremarkable at first glance. But within it was a precise reference, case number, amount, receiving account, details that aligned exactly with the transaction record already on the table. What had been parallel evidence now became intersecting proof. At the bottom of the memo was a signature line, and the name on it was Bondi's, direct, not delegated, not attributed to anyone else. The date on that signature fell just days before her sworn testimony, in which she had clearly stated she had no direct involvement in such financial actions. Now two records existed side by side, one spoken under oath, the other written and signed, and both could not be true at the same time. Meeks did not highlight the contradiction or explain it. He simply allowed it to exist. Bondi looked at the document, her movements controlled, her response delayed. She did not pick it up, maintaining a small but deliberate distance. When she finally spoke, her words were carefully chosen. "I don't recall signing that." It was not a denial, not a claim of error, but a limitation of memory. However, in a structure built on documentation, memory holds little weight. Meeks responded briefly, "The record does." With that, the focus shifted entirely from testimony to evidence. For over a minute, the room remained silent, not because nothing was happening, but because everything had already been placed into the record. Two positions now stood in direct conflict, her prior sworn statement and the signed document, and neither could coexist without consequence. At that point, the hearing moved beyond simple questioning and into demonstration. What had been constructed was not a single contradiction, but a structured sequence of evidence, each document reinforcing the next, each response narrowing the range of possible explanations. The document stretched across the table formed a visible chain: transaction, privilege log, FBI report, confirmation of receipt, and now the authorization memo. Together, they shifted the focus away from one individual action and toward a larger issue: how such a contradiction could exist within a system that is supposed to maintain consistency and accountability. The questioning that followed did not introduce new evidence. It did not need to. Instead, it applied pressure to what was already there. When asked about standard procedures for authorization, Bondi described established protocols and review processes. On its own, the answer was correct. But it did not explain the exception now sitting in front of her, a document that bypassed those standard patterns. This is how structured questioning works at its highest level. It does not accuse. It allows the witness to define the rule and then places evidence beside it that reveals the deviation. Another question followed about disclosure requirements during confirmation proceedings, again simple on the surface. But within the context already established, every answer now carried weight. Because once a contradiction exists in the record, each additional response either resolves it or deepens it. And in this case, the contradiction remained. What had begun as a routine hearing had become something else entirely, a controlled exposure of inconsistency, built step by step through timing, documentation, and sequence, until the point where the record itself spoke louder than any answer that could be given. Bondi responded that all relevant disclosures had been made in accordance with Senate judiciary requirements. On the surface, this was a standard, expected answer, consistent with procedural norms. However, within the context already established, the statement no longer existed in isolation. The FD 302 in the record told a different story, one involving 5 contacts over a 3-week period with a financial intermediary that had not been disclosed during confirmation. The pattern was now visible. Each verbal response described a system functioning correctly, while each document demonstrated a system operating differently. The distance between those two realities became the true space in which the hearing was unfolding. By this point, the room itself had changed in behavior. There were no visible reactions, no side conversations, no audible murmurs. The contradiction had become sustained, and sustained contradictions no longer provoke surprise. They create structure. Bondi's responses to subsequent questions followed a consistent pattern: requests to review documents, lack of recall regarding specific details, and referrals to legal counsel. Individually, these responses were reasonable. Memory is imperfect, documents require review, and legal guidance exists for clarification. But when repeated in sequence, under pressure, and in the presence of authenticated records, they began to reflect not just caution, but limitation. Each response avoided committing to a position that could be directly measured against the established record. At this point, the hearing reached its deeper significance. The focus was no longer simply on what Bondi remembered, but on the boundary between authority and accountability. In government processes, a signature is not symbolic, it represents authorization. It marks the transition from deliberation to execution. When that signature is connected to financial disbursements and linked to a reclassification process involving sensitive case material, its meaning becomes consequential rather than procedural. Now consider the full structure that had emerged: a reclassification order, undisclosed communications, a financial transfer, a privilege log that contradicted earlier public statements, and a signed authorization memo. These elements were not hypothetical, they were sequentially documented. And sequence, once established through records, requires explanation. However, explanation depends on alignment, and alignment was no longer straightforward. Any attempt to reconcile the memo with prior testimony risked contradicting sworn statements, while maintaining earlier testimony risked disregarding documented evidence. Both positions carried consequences, leaving the witness positioned between them. The chair reminded the witness that she remained under oath, not as a warning, but as a procedural clarification. At this stage, the purpose of the hearing had shifted. It was no longer about gathering new information. It was about preserving the integrity of the record. And the record now contained multiple documents describing a process that had not been fully disclosed, a transfer that had not been clearly explained, and an authorization that had not been acknowledged in prior testimony. Outside the room, this carries implications for oversight and further review. Congressional hearings are not endpoints, they are starting points for follow-up. Records entered into the Congressional Archive are intended to be acted upon, not merely observed. At this stage, escalation is often expected, but it does not always occur immediately. Instead, the process tends to remain controlled, allowing the record to speak before actions are taken. As the hearing moved toward closure, a final question was posed: whether Bondi stood by her prior testimony before the Senate Judiciary Committee. This was a direct, binary question. Answering yes would place her testimony in conflict with the documents now in the record. Answering no would challenge statements previously given under oath. Rather than answer immediately, she requested time to review the complete set of documents before reaffirming her position. This response shifted her stance from certainty to conditionality, from a fixed claim to one dependent on further review. In legal and procedural terms, that is a meaningful distinction. Although the formal session was nearing its end, the significance of what had occurred was only beginning to take shape. Once multiple authenticated documents are entered into the congressional record in a structured sequence, they become part of the system itself. They are no longer tied to a single moment. They persist as references for future oversight, review, and potential action. The chair proceeded with closing remarks, but the atmosphere in the room did not relax. The documents remained on the table, unresolved and unchallenged in their totality. Gregory Meeks did not summarize the exchange or provide a concluding statement for emphasis. Instead, he entered all 5 documents into the permanent congressional record as evidence for further review. This act is not rhetorical, it is procedural. It ensures that the materials are preserved, accessible, and available for examination by other authorities with jurisdiction. Once this occurs, the focus shifts from what happened during the hearing to what will be done with the record afterward. Bondi's counsel observed the shift immediately, adjusting posture to assess implications rather than intervene. The emphasis was no longer on controlling the narrative, but on anticipating next steps. Bondi herself remained focused on the memo, the document that now existed both physically on the table and formally within the record, complete with signature and date. At that moment, the distinction between presence and permanence became clear. A document can be questioned while it is present, but once it is entered into the record, it becomes fixed within the system. In the broader context, the hearing was never about a single transaction or a single document. It was about how multiple records interact when placed within a structured timeline. When independent documents converge on the same sequence of events, they create a framework that demands explanation. And when that explanation is not immediately available, the framework does not disappear, it remains in place, guiding further review and potential inquiry. The central issue was never just about individual statements. It was about alignment between what was said under oath and what exists in documented reality, alignment between internal processes and public explanations, and alignment between authority and accountability. What the hearing demonstrated clearly, without theatrics, is what happens when that alignment begins to break. When alignment breaks, it does not fail in a single place. It creates visible strain across the entire structure. A privilege log that contradicts a public statement is not merely a communication issue. It reflects a breakdown in record-keeping. An FD 302 documenting undisclosed contact is not simply an omission. It represents a failure in disclosure. A signed memo that conflicts with sworn testimony is not just an error. It raises a direct question about credibility. When these elements appear together, tied to the same timeline, they are no longer isolated incidents. They form a pattern. That pattern, when viewed outside the hearing room, reflects a system where decisions are made, recorded, and then described differently depending on the audience. This creates a gap between process and presentation. Over time, that gap becomes the point where trust begins to weaken. The public does not interact with internal documents. It relies on statements. When those statements fail to match the records, the question shifts from who made the decision to whether the system producing those statements can still be trusted. This is not a partisan issue. It is not limited to one administration, one official, or one moment in time. It is about consistency in applying rules across all levels of authority. If a signature can exist without acknowledgement, if a financial transfer can occur without clear public explanation, and if contacts can remain undisclosed during confirmation processes, then transparency is no longer consistent, it becomes selective. And selective transparency is not true transparency, it is controlled disclosure. Returning to the room, the gavel falls. The sound is final, procedural, and decisive. Yet nothing before it feels fully resolved. Attendees begin to gather their materials. Papers are stacked, folders are closed, and routine actions resume. However, Bondi remains seated slightly longer than expected, her attention still fixed on the documents in front of her. In that moment, the difference between maintaining control and facing exposure is not determined by what has already occurred, but by what follows next. Her attorney collects the memo and places it into a folder. But the copy entered into the congressional record remains in place. It does not move, it is not removed, and it is not archived away from scrutiny. That version becomes the permanent reference point, the one that can be reviewed, compared, and analyzed by committees, investigators, and oversight bodies. The documents themselves remain unchanged. The entries in the privilege log, the documented contacts within the specified timeframe, the transaction records with their dates and authorization details, and the signed memo that has yet to be reconciled with sworn testimony. Together, they now exist not as separate fragments or claims, but as a consolidated record. This leads to the central question that remains unanswered. If the record and the testimony cannot both be accurate, which one does the system ultimately stand behind? This is not about perception or optics, it is about integrity. And integrity, once challenged at this level, does not simply reset. It either holds under scrutiny or requires correction. Any correction within a documented system leaves its own trace, creating further records that must also be evaluated. What happens next will not be defined by the hearing itself, but by what follows it. The next phase will emerge through follow-up requests, additional disclosures, and whether the documents entered into the record prompt the level of review they were intended to support. Accountability, in this sense, is not immediate. It unfolds over time through the actions taken after the moment has passed. At this point, responsibility shifts away from the individuals directly involved in the hearing and toward the system that now holds the record. The question becomes whether that system will follow the chain of evidence where it leads, reconcile the information now placed side by side, and apply consistent standards across all levels. Alternatively, those documents may remain in the archive without further action, existing as records but not as catalysts for review. The outcome of this process will determine whether what occurred in the hearing remains an isolated event or becomes the starting point for deeper examination. If records like these are to serve their purpose, they must not only exist, they must be acted upon. And that will depend on whether the system chooses to engage with the record fully or allow it to remain static within the archive. Ultimately, the question is not just what was said in the room, but what the record now requires. And the answer will be revealed not in the hearing itself, but in the steps taken afterward. If you find this kind of analysis valuable, make sure to like the video, share it with others, and subscribe to the channel for more updates like this, so you don't miss what happens next.